Hey everybody, it's Guy McDoodfellow, co-chair of the Proving Ground track here at BSides Las Vegas. Our next talk is Human Security Spaghetti and the Wall You're Throwing It At by Masha Arbisman, who was mentored by Tom Porter.
Hello, and welcome to Human Security Spaghetti and the Wall That You're Throwing It At. Changing behavior is difficult, whether you're going about changing your own behaviors like overeating or not sleeping enough, or if you're brave enough to try and change the behaviors of others, like asking your friends to respect boundaries or keeping your employees safe from impastas. Yes, there will be more puns. No, I'm not sorry. Why is the doing part of behavior change, the actual flinging of the spaghetti towards the wall, so difficult? It's not like we don't know what to do. If I'm overeating, I should eat less. If I'm not sleeping enough, I should sleep more. If I'm trying to get employees to use a password manager, I should just tell them to do so. But that's not quite how it works, is it? Just simply telling someone to change their behavior seldom ever really makes lasting change. One of the reasons that it's so hard to elicit lasting change is because of the G.I. Joe fallacy. For those who didn't grow up in the 80s, G.I. Joe had his own cartoon where he'd end every episode with a PSA like, "Kids, don't run into traffic," always followed by, "Now you know, and knowing is half the battle." But knowing is not half the battle. If it were, all of the spaghetti we're flinging to make our lives healthier would actually stick automatically. What the fallacy is misattributing is the effort that it takes to develop and stick to altered behaviors. In fact, telling someone to change their behaviors, or as the security industry has come to term it, spreading awareness, is only about 30% of the full battle towards lasting change. If we look at a human's full journey towards adopting a behavior, it's broken down into 6 stages. Let's take my life, for example. The pandemic was hard, and it's nowhere near over. But after getting vaccinated, I felt a lot safer going about my preemptive care. So I set up a physical with my doctor. I did all of the normal measurements, and when it was time to go over the results, she ever so nicely told me that I had about 20 pounds to lose to be back in the healthier category. I know, upsetty spaghetti. I'd love to pretend that I didn't know this to be true before I stepped into her office. But just by having this conversation, I moved from stage 1, pre-contemplation, into stage 2, awareness. If we were to ask G.I. Joe, then this conversation alone would have achieved half the battle. By her telling me I needed to lose 20 pounds, by golly gee, I've already lost 10. Thankfully, we know better. I know that losing weight will take a lot more effort and dedication than a simple conversation. Entering into stage 3, preparation, I made a schedule of what Peloton classes I would be taking and when. I decided what diet I would stick to, and I told my closest circle of friends of the new behaviors I wanted to exhibit so that they could help keep me accountable. Now, arguably the most difficult stages, 4 and 5, consisted of me getting my butt onto the Peloton to complete the classes, of my dedicating Sundays to meal prep, of only eating the foods that I prepped instead of ordering delivery, and probably the hardest, keeping to only 1 or 2 drinks when meeting up with friends. As all of us New Year's resolutioners know, we mere humans tend to relapse on behaviors. For example, my biggest downfall is travel. I forget the healthy part of my identity as soon as I make it to a different city. For example, I will be traveling between the time this talk is recorded and the Q&A session that's live in about 20 minutes. If you ask me if I had a hoagie the day that I landed in Philly, the answer is probably going to be yes. But I'll slowly transition from my stage 6 relapse back to the pre-contemplation phase and start the cycle all over again. Rewinding back, if awareness on its own only makes up one stage, is gained before the 30% mark of the cycle, and doesn't account for effort, why is it still considered half the battle when it comes to educating and training our employees against threat? It's time to focus on measurable actions that your employees take with a focus on changing behaviors so that these actions become an automatic response to the different contexts employees face. It's time for behavioral engineering. I'm lucky enough to head such a team that focuses on creating cybersecurity culture by weaving security into each employee's identity. Our aim is to change behaviors for the better so that people do the actions that we have previously identified as effective at breaking real-world attacks. Attacks that require human intervention to break. So how do we do this? We partner with our red and blue teams, of course, to identify real attacks that can only be thwarted by behavior change. We identify what behaviors might mitigate those attacks, we measure those behaviors, and effectively, we throw spaghetti until we see a positive change in those behaviors. Always ready to iterate what's working and doubling down, always ready to iterate on what's not working and doubling down on what does. One of the most effective techniques that our red team has in its arsenal of attacks is capturing credentials. So we as a team set out with the goal of lowering credential capture rate in general. In order to be successful at setting a behavioral goal, you want to be as contextually specific as possible. What I mean by that is if you're telling your employees to do the secure thing or always be alert, you're not giving them enough context to be effective. You're leaving the correct behavior up to their interpretation. Which leads me to my first rule that we live by: no impossible advice. Make sure that the advice you're giving is actually actionable. The best way to do so is to take the time to get to know your audience, understand their day-to-day, figure out if the security policies and solutions that you're instilling actually enable your employees to do their jobs, instead of standing in the way of what they're paid to do. And lastly, lean on those partnerships that you have, or create new partnerships with the teams whose programs look like yours. The benefits team, for example, that already has a reward structure in place, or the marketing team that already uses behavioral insights to funnel communication. There's absolutely no need to reinvent the wheel when you can live off the land. Okay. So if we're not telling people to not click links, what are we telling them to do? When it came to minimizing credential capture, we focused in on one behavioral goal. When your corporate account receives an email sending you to a website asking for your credentials, we want all employees to report that email. Now I know what you're thinking, but Masha, if they report every email that asks for credentials, the blue team is going to hate you with all of the false positives, which is why we partnered with our blue team. We combed through the data and we partnered with them to see if there were other ways to minimize corporate comms being marked as phish or spam. Not only did the blue team agree that it was best to get more reports than less, but they also worked with us to train our comms teams to use an anti-phishing footer, which allowed employees a point of contact to verify legitimacy. With the lofty goal set, we broke our approach up into two main categories: the technology side and the human side. On the technology side, we ask questions like, are there technologies that we are using or can use that will make it harder for employees to give up credentials on spoof domains? And can we make the behavior we want exhibited the default behavior that they take? There were quite a few solutions that popped into mind, like, for example, enabling email filtering so that less junk made it into their inbox in the first place, or installing external tagging so that they were made more aware of emails coming from outside of the enterprise. But probably the coolest technology fix was realizing that we could train employees to use our corporate password manager's autofill functions to spot spoof domains. If they landed on a single sign-on page where the password manager did not auto-populate, it's because the domain was not recognized. Our corporate password manager became the answer to fixing a lot of pre-taught human behaviors around credential capture. Generating passwords from within the tool ensured unique and strong passwords, and it broke the conditioned behavior of employees typing in credentials when they hit the single sign-on page. If you don't know your password, you can't type it in. With our hero on the technology side identified, we needed to drive adoption of the password manager. That's where social science techniques came in. Digging into my analogy a tad more, when you're initially throwing spaghetti at the wall, not everything is going to stick. With time and with data and paying attention to what does stick more and why it may be sticking, it'll benefit your program overall. One of the ways we went about gaining interest and promoting adoption that did end up sticking was the use of competition. What started out as a dashboard for us to be able to track whether our spaghetti was sticking quickly turned into a tool for executives to use to bait each other. By creating a dashboard for each org that not only pointed at their own completion and adoption of behaviors, but also showed how they ranked against other orgs, we created passive competition. Imagine a meeting where you're our CTO and the chief marketing officer uses this dashboard to show that the marketing org is kicking the technology org's butt. You're going to want to hype up your org to do better. You are, after all, the head of technology, and the technology team should be the best at adopting new technologies. It was great to get the passive competition done for us. The active competition, on the other hand, was supported with the use of incentives and rewards to promote security identity. Swag was awarded for good behavior. Those that rose to the top of the behavior charts from each org were knighted as password manager knights and awarded t-shirts and stickers to support this newly achieved identity. Special events were held to honor and celebrate the knighthood, and these knights became our spokespeople or influencers that spoke on behalf of the amazing benefits of using a password manager. The reason that we created the Knighthood was specifically to play into identity. When an employee adds Security Knight to their employee identity, they were more likely to exhibit and highlight the secure behaviors that they identified with. This swag was fought over, and it became an effective way to instill culture by shifting identity. When it came to communication, we understood that employees' attention was a sacred and scarce resource, meaning there was in fact a thing as too much communication. So we had to be smart about the types of communication that directly came from us versus what was shared from among their peers and that came from leadership. We of course provided what most are used to, the more expected style of annual security awareness training in the form of videos. But we made the videos fun and completely custom. Employees would see their peers and leaders participating in the Paranoids games or on Who Wants to Be a Paranoid. The photos here are screen caps of our internal trainings. And the reason that we use so many relatable faces is because of a psychological phenomenon called social proof, wherein people tend to copy the actions of others in an attempt to fit in, which is ultimately all that we as humans want in life, a community to belong to. To further support the community, we shifted our focus from simply training folks on how to be a secure employee to caring about them as a human as a whole, and putting effort into presenting them with real world situations where their identity and personal security hygiene could be improved. There was a high visibility employee who had their personal Twitter account taken over, and they came to us asking for help. They worked as a reporter with one of our brands, and it was possible that the attacker would not only use this platform to influence or really piss off the reporter's following, but also could use the account takeover as a step to ultimately attack the company. We pointed the reporter towards a how-to article shown above about recovering from a personal account takeover. And by focusing on their safety and well-being as a whole human, we got to reap the benefits of the default well-being it brought to them as an employee. With this plethora of education, it was not always easy to understand when or where to present communications in a way that would benefit employees when they needed it most. And in order to understand when they needed it most, we needed to understand them. A large portion of what I'm seeing missing in standard security awareness programming is the lack of customized messaging. Standard practices treat developers and sales associates and HR executives and others all the same, as if their jobs were not any different, so the security messaging towards them shouldn't be either. Imagine how effective your system could be if it looked at and grouped the employees based on their security identities, the systems that they use, the permissions that they have, the types of attacks that they're most susceptible to, and so on. Using HR data and your own grouping criteria, you can do just this. Now, imagine being able to hit employees with tailored communication from all sides, top down, bottom up, self-paced, and at the moments they need it most. Let's start from top down. By asking executives to spread our security messaging, we shifted the paradigm of how our security team was seen. Executives got an email once a month with their org's progress, a link to their customer report that we saw earlier, which shows how their org is doing versus other orgs, and most importantly, a message that they can copy and paste through email or Slack, or that they could just read out loud at their team meetings. Instead of the traditional way security teams are viewed, as the bullies running around and chasing employees with a stick of new policies, cascading communications allows for your team to be seen as a partner that helps employees with the ask that comes straight from their leaders and executives. Nudge communications parallel cascading communications, except they focus on the bottom-up approach. The reason to use nudge communications is because you can point to a person's behavior as they do it. Much like rubbing your pet's nose in the business they just exhibited, you'll be more successful with humans if you can point in time, show them what behaviors they need to shift. Nudge campaigns can take many forms, like, for example, email alerts or application banners or pop-ups, help chats on consumer websites, or language-based Slack messages that fire on keywords. In the example shown here, you can see what happens when a user types in fish or phishing or susceptible email. The Slack bot reminds them how and where to report fishy emails. Similarly, when they type in password or password is or password colon, they're reminded not to share credentials over Slack and instead to use their corporate password manager to do so. With all of these customized communications, it was also super important to provide users a way to personally benchmark their progress. This dashboard is available to all of our employees and is created to look up their specific adoption or susceptibility scores to provide them with the whole picture, specifically when looking at the security behaviors that matter most to our team. All right. I just threw a lot at you. That was a lot of spaghetti. Are your knees weak? Are your arms heavy? Just kidding. We've made the behaviors we want the easiest ones to exhibit. We've employed technology to help reduce friction. We've enabled employees with different types of communications that are custom to them. And when we threw the spaghetti, found what stuck, and served up a hot plate, we noticed a trend. If you look all the way to the left of the graph, the start of our journey, we started with the traditional security awareness approach. We told our company that we had purchased a corporate password manager and that everyone would get a free corporate and personal account to use. We even told them twice. And sure, there was some adoption, but the line was pretty flat and the climb was slow. Then we made the behavior we wanted the easiest as possible to adopt. We installed the corporate password manager to all endpoints. Now, when employees went to look for it, they didn't have to go through the hefty installation process, and instead, they could jump straight into learning how to use the tool. Over time, the adoption petered out again, and it wasn't until we launched the behavior dashboards that we saw another huge spike. People were talking about it. They wanted the swag. They wanted to do better than those around them. The biggest improvement, though, that we saw overall came when we enabled executives to lead the messaging and provided nudges as employees exhibited the wrong behaviors. As you can see, telling people to do something was nowhere close to as effective as actually enabling the spaghetti. When it came to the adoption of our corporate password manager, behavioral engineering made a much bigger impact than the standard security awareness approach. And thankfully, the spaghetti has proven to stick among all the measures that we originally baselined. Over the last 2 years, we've seen improvements everywhere. Credential capture rate has halved. Susceptibility rate is down 10x. Reporting rate of both simulations and real attacks has more than doubled. And the adoption rate of our corporate password manager has tripled. If you leave here with anything today, please leave here with the following. First, prioritize your own needs over what the industry tells you to be true. Use the data and partnerships available to you to figure out what your population needs most. Get to know your population. Just like you can't change your own behaviors without truly understanding yourself and what causes the behaviors in the first place, you won't be able to change the behaviors of others without leading with empathy. Security awareness is so last year. Saucy take, I know. Lean on those who understand content, who understand people, who understand data, those who can iterate quickly, and those who are not afraid to be wrong. They tend to live outside of the security industry, so don't be afraid to take a chance on them because security knowledge can always be taught. Point out behavioral changes as soon as you can and contextualize what it is you want to see from your end users. And if you absolutely forget the last 20 minutes and really only leave here with one thing, please teach those around you and yourself to use a dang password manager. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm here with Masha. So, did you get the hoagie?
I did, in fact, and I'm almost embarrassed to say that it may have been more than one.
More than one? Man, you're ambitious. What did you get?
A South Philly Italian sub is what they called it, and it was delicious.
Gotcha. All right. Well, we've got our first question from Gabe in Discord, Gabe the engineer. How did the stages of changing behavior align with the sales funnel?
Fantastic question, and I think Gabe asks this because he knows me and knows that I have a background in marketing, so tricky Gabe. Gabe is actually the reason that I was featured on this year's Verizon's DBIR. If you haven't checked that out, it's a very good read all the way through. Gabe, I don't actually think that the sales funnel maps directly onto the stages of behavior change, but loosely speaking, your top of funnel, which is your marketers, would be looking at stage 1 and stage 2. So pre-contemplation and contemplation, kind of gaining the awareness of the product. The preparation stage, I think, would be kind of split between your top of funnel and your middle, so somewhere between your marketers and your business development reps. The actual action of either scheduling a meeting or possibly buying the product would be somewhere between 4 and 5. And then your customer success team would be really, really important in keeping people from relapse and kind of re-signing on with the deal.
Okay, makes sense. So, all right, next question. Let's see. I was in a cyber camp just yesterday, and they were telling me never to use a password manager. Why and why not?
Oh my gosh. Go to a different cyber camp. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
The best thing that you can do for yourself in terms of password management all around is to use a password manager. I like to think of a password manager the way that you think of a safe at home, where you're literally putting all of your most important luxury items instead of, say, perhaps scattering your luxury items around the house, hoping that people don't find them. A password manager is the best thing to do simply because that tool's only job is to generate important passwords and save them. So your brain does not have to do the action of trying to create new and unique passwords for absolutely every single thing and remember everything. Trust in our tools.
Right. That is actually something. So my wife is an education professor, and she refers to this phenomenon as something called distributed cognition. So basically, you're offloading part of your brain to do something else. That's why we have books. That's why we have paper, right? And this is just yet another tool for that thing, right? We suck at remembering passwords. We suck at being sources of entropy. Just use the tool.
Yeah. Okay. Attention is very, very scarce. Don't overload your brain.
So Gabe has another question. Was the progress over the 2 years linear? Did it taper off or speed up?
Yes. It did taper off. It did speed up. Really, if you go back to that one slide that I pointed out where it was a graph that went up, you can see the different places where different campaigns had more of an impact. Thankfully, over time, you can map a linear progression, though there are very obvious places where it kind of looped.
Was it more of like a punctuated equilibrium? So you'd have periods where it'd be slow and then everything started happening at once and then...
Exactly.
Okay. All right, that's all the questions we have at the moment, unless I see somebody's typing in Discord. Hold on a second. So if someone gained access to my laptop, would my password manager be in danger?
Yes, but if someone gained access to your laptop, your everything is in danger.
Right, and this is sort of the idea of compensating controls in layered defense and depth, right? So this is why we have full disk encryption for laptops, right? And a lot of password managers now, I know 1Password and LastPass do this. You can do a remote revocation. So basically, you revoke the credentials for the target in question. So I've had that happen. Somebody stole a laptop, and we ended up just using the tool in 1Password to say, just revoke all access to the vault here.
Yep.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. So Easy Desert Gator asks, how would you tweak this approach if your audience were computer literate but not very techy? Ooh, that's interesting.
That is interesting. I would not tailor the approach pretty much at all.
Okay.
What I would tailor is the type of communication that you give. So making sure that you're actually speaking to what your audience is used to hearing is the best way to do so. So again, I would double down in focusing on that, the user research, the gaining understanding of your audience and tailoring whatever it is you're doing to them specifically.
Cool. All right. I think that's all the time we have for questions, but this was a wonderful talk. I loved it. I'm going to go grab that paper and read it. Oh, we have 5 more minutes?
Thank you. Sounds great.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we have plenty of time. So Miles is mentioning another option is a description text file or an encrypted text file, however, doesn't offer the option of distributed access. I did that for a while. I kept a KeyPass vault on a USB stick, and honestly, 1Password is so much better at being retarded.
I would just continue to think about it, that it's literally that solution's one job to do this. So they're iterating on it over time, nonstop, because it's their duty to do so. It's not our duty to kind of iterate on those processes. So I would trust the expert in this case.
Right. And the nice thing about 1Password specifically is that there's a bunch of features that sort of every time I ask a question like, well, there's a feature missing or a gap, it seems like in the next release they've solved it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Command line access to 1Password vaults is awesome. Being able to store keys in 1Password and then pull them out and use them once for tools like AWS or Azure is really nice. And
if you think about it on the corporate level.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Think about it on the corporate level.
No, I was going to say, if you think about it on the corporate level, you can't really control everybody. And if your audience is the non-techie, so to say, it's easier to teach them this one thing that is much more user-friendly than it is to attempt to teach them encrypted files and whatnot.
Right. It's just the best way to solve it. Okay, so another question from Gabe. What additional behaviors do you hope to address in the future?
Ooh, the biggest one for me is 2FA adoption. I think that is next year's big challenge.
Okay. And how, so using the framework, how would you, just spitball this, how would you work on rolling that out? How would you work on using the framework you laid out?
First and foremost, the technology solution has to fit the user base. So going through and figuring out what machines your users are using. If you're 80% Mac folk, I would highly suggest looking into the Mac biometrics features. So make things as dumb-proof, as easy as possible, and go through there. That's gonna be my first focus.
Sure. All right. What about things like, so talk about tailoring to the people you're working with. What about the TOTP based systems like on a phone versus YubiKeys? So when would you recommend something like a YubiKey or similar hardware token versus just encouraging people to use phones?
Yeah, it would highly depend. It would highly depend on the people and what they're capable of in terms of adoption, and it would depend on their kind of profile within the company as well. If they're more on the higher profile side, like our reporters, like our executives, I would probably go towards the YubiKey in general. But again, I'm going to lean right back on research. Research your people, research what they need, research what they use, and go from there.
Okay. So once you've done that initial stage of research, now the next, what would be the next step in your mind?
You push out whatever technology you decide in terms of getting it onto people's machines, making sure it's enabled, make sure it works, getting people the YubiKey functions, and so on. Then it's the comms machine. It's the educational portion. It's figuring out how they learn best and catering to them. Our employee base varies so much in the way that people learn, whether it be auditory or visual or video or reading. So being able to encompass everybody and the way that they digest information the best is kind of that next step.
And what about adapting that education as you go? I mean, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. You'll run into situations where this browser is no longer supported, or this works in Edge but not in Chrome or whatever, right? How do you tailor your education to adapt to situations like that during rollout?
100%. It's that spaghetti, right? You basically just do it on the flow. If you have the ability to do it beforehand, by all means, please do. We've definitely had different versions of different educational articles put together to make sure that they get sent out at different times depending on when people need them. But it's all about admitting to your mistakes or the mistakes of other solutions and adopting as you go. The more transparent and honest you can be with humans, the better adoption rate is going to be overall.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for Q&A. Thank you, Masha. This was a fantastic talk. I'm looking forward to reading the paper.
Thanks so much. Thank you all. I'll be on Discord all day.
Absolutely.